My name is Ruby Blackwood, and I'm 32 years old. For most of my life, I've been the family footnote, the quiet archivist in a dynasty of roaring centaurs. My family doesn't just ride horses, they are defined by them. They measure worth in show ribbons and the thunder of hooves, which meant I was perpetually out of step, a creature of paper and silence in a world of leather and noise. I never expected that the one thing they always dismissed about me, my love for dusty, forgotten books, would become the weapon that saved our entire legacy from collapsing into ruin. I never imagined that my quietest moment would be the loudest victory our family had ever known. But before I dive into the story of how a forgotten king's promise, hidden in a book of poetry, silenced the hammers of the auctioneers and humbled the proudest riders I've ever known, I want to connect with all of you out there. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt overlooked or had your passions dismissed by the people who were supposed to support you, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers, make sure to subscribe to join a community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. Blackwood Manor wasn't just a house, it was a character in our family's long and dramatic play. It stood on a gentle rise in the countryside, a sprawling Tudor behemoth of dark timbers, mullioned windows and ivy that seemed to hold the gray stones together. Its chimneys breathed history, and its halls echoed with the ghosts of 8 generations of Blackwoods who had lived, loved, and died within its walls. More importantly, they had ridden. The heart of the estate wasn't the grand hall or the ballroom, it was the stables, a magnificent brick courtyard surrounded by stalls that housed equine royalty, each horse worth more than a small-town car. The air at Blackwoods smelled perpetually of hay, old leather, and money. It was a scent I associated with being invisible. My family, the Blackwoods, were a force of nature, loud, confident, and utterly convinced of their own place in the world. At the center of this glittering constellation was my cousin Edwin. He was a year older than me, and he was everything a Blackwood was supposed to be. He had the easy grace of a born rider, a jawline that could cut glass, and a laugh that made everyone in the room turn and smile. He didn't just ride horses, he commanded them. Trophies lined the mantelpieces, portraits of him mid-jump hung in the hallways, and every family dinner was an encore performance of his latest equestrian triumph. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets orbiting his brilliance, content to reflect his light. My uncle Caspian, Edwin's father and the current patriarch, saw him as the culmination of our lineage, a living, breathing symbol of Blackwood dominance. And then there was me. If Edwin was the sun, I was a shadow in the corner of the library. My parents had passed away in a car accident when I was young, leaving me to be raised by my aunt and uncle alongside their perfect son. They were never cruel, not in the overt way that makes for simple stories. Theirs was a neglect born of incomprehension. They simply didn't understand a child who preferred the silent company of books to the thrill of a gallop. While Edwin was learning to post and canter, I was learning to identify the watermarks in 18th century paper. While he collected blue ribbons, I collected knowledge about bookworms, bindery techniques, and the slow, graceful decay of organic materials. I became a book and paper conservator, a profession that was, in their eyes, both impossibly quaint and utterly useless. They called me the family librarian, a title that was meant to be affectionate but always landed with the soft thud of dismissal. I lived at the manor, a permanent fixture in a wing that housed the vast, neglected library, my rent paid in the unspoken currency of being the quiet, unobtrusive poor relation. The library was my kingdom. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with the intellectual debris of generations. It smelled of decaying paper, leather, and wood smoke from the cavernous fireplace that was rarely lit. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy, leaded glass windows. To my family, it was a storage room for old books. To me, it was a sanctuary. Every book had a story beyond the words on its pages, a story in its binding, its foxed pages, its marginalia. I knew their secrets. I knew which tome had been singed in a small fire in 1923, which collection of poetry had been a heartbroken gift from a jilted ancestor, and which philosophical treatise had an amusing doodle of a bishop in the margins. This was my world, a world of quiet facts and tangible history. It was a world away from the thunderous, competitive arena my family inhabited. A typical family dinner was a masterclass in my own invisibility. I remember one evening in late autumn, the dining room aglow with candlelight that reflected off the polished silver. Edwin, naturally, held court at the center of the long mahogany table. He was recounting, with dramatic flair, his victory at the Penhurst trials. He spoke of a treacherous water jump, the roar of the crowd, the perfect synergy between him and his magnificent steed, Apollo. The beast just knew. Edwin boomed, his eyes alight. I gave him the slightest nudge, a whisper, really, and he just flew. We were one entity. My Uncle Caspian beamed, his chest puffed with pride. That's Blackwood blood, my boy. Nerves of steel and a connection to the horse. You can't teach that. My aunt chimed in, her voice dripping with adoration. Oh, it was breathtaking. The photos in the county paper simply didn't do it justice. I had spent my own day making a fascinating discovery. While repairing a 17th-century herbal, I had found a rare example of a German case binding technique that wasn't thought to have been used in England until much later. It was a small but significant detail that could shift a tiny corner of bookbinding history. I was buzzing with the quiet excitement of it, waiting for a lull in the conversation, a moment when the tidal wave of Edwin worship receded. I cleared my throat. I actually found something quite interesting today, I began, my voice feeling small in the cavernous room. In one of the old herbals, the binding, Uncle Caspian cut me off, not with malice, but with the casual obliviousness of a man whose attention was a finite resource reserved for important matters. Edwin, speaking of flying, we must talk to the farrier about Apollo's shoes. I noticed a slight wear on the front left. We can't afford any issues before the Winter Championships. Edwin nodded seriously. You're right, Dad. I'll call him first thing tomorrow. And just like that, the conversation had moved on. My discovery, my work, my entire world was less important than a piece of metal on a horse's hoof. Edwin glanced at me across the table, a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't triumph, it was more like pity. He gave me a small, patronizing smile, a silent acknowledgement of my attempt to participate, before turning back to the far more serious business of his own glory. I felt the familiar hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I picked up my fork and pushed a piece of potato around my plate, my appetite gone. It doesn't matter, Ruby, I told myself, the same mantra I'd been repeating for 20 years. What you do matters to you. That's enough. But on nights like that, it never felt like enough. This dynamic had been set in stone since childhood. I remember our 10th birthdays. Edwin's and mine are only a week apart. The entire family gathered on the sprawling lawn. For Edwin, they let out a magnificent dapple gray pony with a gleaming leather saddle. It was a creature of myth and magic, and Edwin, already a confident little rider, swung himself onto its back with a whoop of joy. My uncle's face was a mask of pure adoration. He saw not just his son, but the future of the Blackwood legacy. My gift was a beautifully bound, complete set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. I was thrilled. I loved the smell of the new pages, the promise of all the knowledge held within. I ran to my uncle to thank him. He patted my head, his eyes already drifting back to the pony. That's nice, dear, he said, his voice distant. A girl should have her books. Then he turned completely, shouting instructions to Edwin about his posture. I stood there, holding a heavy volume, watching my cousin become the center of the universe while I was gently relegated to the footnotes. The only person who ever seemed to see the value in my world was Mr. Gable, the family solicitor. He was a man in his late 70s, with a kind, crinkled face and a mind as sharp as a solicitor's letter. His family had been handling the Blackwoods' legal affairs for over a century. He would occasionally visit the manor for business, and, unlike the others, he would always make a detour to the library. He'd find me at my large work table, surrounded by the tools of my trade, bone folders, fine brushes, pots of wheat starch paste. He would peer at my work with genuine interest. "And what treasure have you rescued today, Miss Ruby?" he would ask, his voice a gentle rumble. I would show him a repaired spine or a page I had painstakingly deacidified, and he would listen, truly listen, as I explained the process. "A remarkable skill," he said once, looking at me over the top of his spectacles. "Patience and precision, qualities this family often overlooks in its rush to the finish line." His visits were small islands of validation in my sea of invisibility. I cherished them. The end of our world arrived not with a bang, but with the crisp rustle of expensive stationery. It was a letter delivered by a courier on a Tuesday morning. It was addressed to my Uncle Caspian from a prestigious London law firm I'd never heard of, Thorne and Associates. I was in the morning room, cataloging some estate maps when he opened it. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving his normally ruddy complexion a pasty gray. He read it once, then twice, his hand trembling slightly. "Caspian, "What is it?" my aunt asked, her voice laced with concern. He didn't answer. He simply handed her the letter. She read it, her hand flying to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. Edwin, who had been scrolling through something on his phone, finally looked up, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. "What's wrong?" The letter announced a legal challenge to the very foundation of our existence. It was from a family named Devereux. They claimed that their ancestors, not ours, were the rightful owners of the Blackwood estate. The letter alleged that the original land transfer in 1683 was fraudulent, procured through political coercion during a period of great turmoil following the Rye House plot. It stated that the deed was never properly ratified by the Crown, and that a key signatory was forced to sign under duress. The Devereux, the letter claimed, had recently unearthed new, compelling evidence to support their case and were formally filing a suit to reclaim their ancestral lands. All of it. The manor, the stables, the hundreds of acres of rolling hills. Everything. Panic, cold and sharp, ripped through the comfortable tapestry of our lives. An emergency family meeting was convened that evening in the grand hall. The portraits of our ancestors stared down at us, their painted eyes seeming to hold a new note of accusation. Mr. Gable had been summoned, and he sat at the head of the table, his expression grave as he reviewed the documents Thorne and Associates had included. The air was thick with a kind of fear I'd never seen in my family. Their confidence, which I had always thought was as solid as the manor's oak beams, was gone, replaced by a brittle anxiety. Edwin, for the first time in his life, was not the center of attention because of a victory. He looked lost, his usual easygoing posture replaced by a tense rigidity. "This is absurd," he blustered, his voice a little too loud. "We've been here for over 300 years. Just tell them to get lost. Can't we just, I don't know, buy them off? What do they want, money?" Mr. Gable sighed, polishing his glasses with a silk handkerchief. "It's not that simple, Edwin. This isn't a negotiation, it's a claim of title. They're not asking for money, they're claiming the very ground beneath our feet, and their legal team is formidable. Thorne is one of the most aggressive property litigation firms in the country. They wouldn't take a case like this unless they believed they had a very strong chance of winning." Uncle Caspian slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. "But it's nonsense. Fraudulent? Our family was granted these lands for loyalty to the Crown." "Indeed," Mr. Gable said calmly, "and that is what our defense will rest upon. However, they claim the documentation of that grant is flawed. They allege the copy of the deed held in the county records is a later transcription, and that the original has been lost to time for at least 2 centuries. Their entire case hinges on the absence of that original document." The room fell silent. The absence of something. A hole in our history. Edwin, ever the man of action, tried to reassert himself. "This is a fight," he declared, standing up and pacing in front of the fireplace. "Blackwoods don't back down from a fight. Maybe I should pay a visit to this Mr. Devereux. A man-to-man conversation. Remind him who we are." My aunt looked hopeful, but Mr. Gable shook his head slowly. "I would strongly advise against that, Edwin. This is not a battle to be won in a show-jumping ring or with a firm handshake. This will be a war fought on paper, in archives and courtrooms. It will be won or lost on the fine print of history." I sat in my usual place, on a small chair slightly away from the main table, a silent observer. They had forgotten I was even in the room. I listened to them talk about deeds, ratifications, and historical precedents. They spoke of the Monmouth Rebellion and King Charles II, names that were not just history to me, but the daily texture of my work. While they panicked, a different feeling began to stir in me. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a faint, familiar hum, the hum of a puzzle, a problem that couldn't be solved by a horse, a problem that could only be solved by a librarian. The golden boy of the family, the star equestrian, was utterly, profoundly helpless. His skills were useless here. He couldn't ride his way out of a legal challenge. He couldn't charm a historical document into existence. In the days that followed, Edwin's attempt to handle it was as disastrous as Mr. Gable had predicted. Against all advice, he secured a meeting with the lead partner at Thorne and Associates, a woman named Ms. Jennings. He went in his finest tweed, radiating the effortless authority that had always worked for him. He apparently intended to leverage the Blackwood name, to imply that this nuisance lawsuit was beneath them all and could be quietly resolved. He returned to the manor that afternoon looking like a ghost. I was in the hall, dusting the frame of a landscape painting, and saw him come through the front door. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale. He walked past me without a word and went straight to his father's study. Later, through the thick oak door, I heard the raised, desperate voice of my uncle. I only caught snippets, but it was enough. "She laughed at me, Dad," Edwin was saying, his voice cracking with a humiliation he'd never before experienced. "She had a file, a timeline of our family's finances. She knew about the bad investments in the 90s. She knew we were mortgaged to the hilt. She called us land rich and cash poor. She said the Blackwood name was a historical footnote, not a threat. She just sat there and dismantled me. The hero had fallen. The family's belief that their name and presence could solve any problem had been shattered by a sharp-witted lawyer with a well-researched file. The panic in the house curdled into a thick, pervasive despair. The staff whispered in the kitchens. My aunt took to her bed with migraines. Uncle Caspian spent hours on the phone, his voice a low, angry growl as he spoke with bankers and financial advisors. The lively, confident energy of Blackwood Manor had been replaced by the silence of a wake. They were grieving for a home they hadn't even lost yet. The legal meetings became a daily ritual. I was never invited, of course. My presence wasn't required. I was just the librarian. But the study doors weren't soundproof. I would sit in the library, the closest room, pretending to read but really listening to the worried murmurs. It was during one of these overheard conversations that the pieces began to click into place for me. Mr. Gable's voice was clear and precise, cutting through my uncle's panicked rambling. The Devereux claim centers on the deed of transfer of 1683. They have a sworn affidavit from a historian, a specialist in the late Stuart period, who argues that the political climate following the Rye House plot made such a land grant from King Charles II to our ancestor, Baron Alistair Blackwood, highly irregular and likely coerced. They contend the lack of the original royal charter, the one bearing the king's own seal, is proof that the grant was never officially legitimized. Without that charter, they argue, the land should have reverted to the Devereux family upon the death of their patriarch, who they claim was the last legal owner. King Charles II, the Rye House plot. A royal charter from 1683. These weren't just abstract legal terms to me. They were my world. I knew that period intimately. I knew the paper they used, the iron gall ink, the kind of wax for the seals. I knew Baron Alistair Blackwood, at least on paper. I had handled his books, read his letters, even conserved a map he had drawn himself. While my family was drowning in legal jargon, I was seeing a historical puzzle, and I realized, with a sudden shocking clarity, that I was the only person in this family equipped to even begin solving it. A quiet resolve settled over me. They wouldn't ask for my help, so I wouldn't offer it. I would simply give it. I began my work in the one place I knew better than anyone, the archives. The estate's archives were a chaotic mess, housed in a cold, damp room in the oldest part of the manor. Generations of Blackwoods had tossed documents in here with little regard for order or preservation. It was a historian's nightmare, but for me it was familiar territory. I started a methodical search, my conservator's gloves moving with practiced care over brittle papers and crumbling leather ledgers. I was looking for anything from the 1680s account books, letters, diaries, anything that might mention the land grant or the charter. Days blurred into a montage of dust and disappointment. I worked from dawn until long after the family had gone to bed, fueled by lukewarm tea and a stubborn refusal to fail. The air in the archive room was thick with the smell of decay, a scent that now felt like a metaphor for our family's fortunes. I found records of livestock sales, receipts for masonry work, a love letter from a stable hand to a milkmaid. But of the charter, there was nothing. An entire section of records from the late 17th century was simply gone. A note in a much later ledger mentioned a minor fire in the West Wing library in the 19th. It was likely they had been lost then. It was a dead end. My family, absorbed in their own panic, barely registered my efforts. They saw me covered in dust, my hair tied back messily, and they saw what they always saw, Ruby, hiding in her books. One afternoon, Edwin found me in the archive room, a smudge of dirt on my cheek. He was on his way back from the stables, the only place he seemed to find any solace. He leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, a shadow of his former confidence clinging to him. "Still playing with your dusty papers, Ruby?" he asked. There was no real malice in it, just a weary, condescending sadness, while the rest of us are trying to figure out how to solve a real problem. The words stung, but they also ignited a spark of anger in me. A real problem? This was the real problem. This dusty, forgotten history was the battlefield, and he didn't even know how to hold a weapon. "History is the problem, Edwin," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, "and you can't ride a horse through it." He just shook his head and walked away, leaving me alone in the silent, musty room. That night, I almost gave up. I sat on the cold stone floor, surrounded by piles of useless documents, and felt a wave of despair wash over me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just playing. But as I was about to pack it all in, my eyes fell on a small leather-bound diary from the mid-18th century. I had already scanned it, but I picked it up again, needing a distraction. It belonged to a woman named Beatrice Blackwood, an ancestor I knew little about. I flipped through the pages, her elegant script detailing the mundanities of her life, gossip, weather, social calls. And then I saw it, a single entry that made my heart stop. Spent the afternoon in the great library, she had written, attempting to organize Papa's collection, a fool's errand. He was a brilliant man, but chaotic. His most treasured volumes are catalogued in his private Bibliotheca Blackwoodiana. But the man himself was a squirrel hiding his nuts. He always said that the importance of a document should be matched by the vessel that carries it. I fear we shall never find half of what he tucked away between the pages of his beloved books. The importance of a document should be matched by the vessel that carries it. The words echoed in my mind. Baron Alistair Blackwood, the man who had received the charter, hadn't filed it away. He had hidden it, and he had hidden it in a book. The sheer breathtaking logic of it struck me like a physical blow. Of course, a man who loved books more than anything would entrust his most precious document to one. The lost charter wasn't lost at all. It was sitting on a shelf, somewhere in the 2 stories of the main library, waiting to be found. I wasn't at a dead end. I was at the beginning of the real search. A new monumental task lay before me. I had to check every single book from the 17th century. There were nearly 1,000 of them. The excitement that filled me was so potent it pushed away all the exhaustion and despair. This was a puzzle I was uniquely qualified to solve. This was my fight, and for the first time in my life, I felt a thrilling, terrifying certainty that I was going to win it. The clock was ticking. Mr. Gable had informed us that the Devereuxs had successfully filed for a preliminary court hearing. It was scheduled for Friday, in 2 days. They were seeking an injunction to freeze all of the Blackwoods' assets, effectively paralyzing us and preventing us from selling off anything to fund our defense. If they succeeded, it would be the beginning of the end. The mood in the manor became funereal. Every conversation was whispered. Every footstep seemed to echo with impending doom. My aunt drifted through the halls like a wraith, while Uncle Caspian just sat in his study, staring out the window at the lands he was about to lose. Edwin had completely retreated into himself. He no longer went to the stables. He just sat in the drawing room, nursing a glass of whiskey, the firelight catching the hollows in his face. The golden boy was broken. He was a king without a kingdom, a rider without a course. I, on the other hand, had never felt more alive. The library became my entire world. I worked systematically, shelf by shelf, book by book. I pulled each 17th century volume, my gloved hands treating them with the reverence they deserved. I was a surgeon searching for a hidden tumor. I examined each one, feeling the weight, checking the flexibility of the spine, running my fingers over the end papers, searching for any telltale thickness, any sign of tampering. I looked for hollowed-out sections, for pages that seemed too stiff, for any marginalia that might be a clue. It was meticulous, exhausting work. I slept for a few hours each night on a chaise lounge in the library, waking with the ghost of faded ink in my nostrils. Mr. Gable was my only visitor. He would bring me a thermos of hot sweet tea in the evenings, his tired eyes full of a hope he seemed to have placed solely in me. "Any luck, my dear?" he'd ask gently. "Not yet," I'd reply, my voice hoarse from disuse. "But I feel it, Mr. Gable. It's here. I know it is." He would pat my shoulder. "If anyone can find it, Ruby, it's you. The family, they don't see it. They're looking for a cavalry charge. But this battle requires a cryptographer." His words were the fuel that kept me going through the long, silent nights. By Thursday evening, the eve of the hearing, I was on the verge of collapse. I had been through hundreds of books, histories, scientific treatises, religious texts, plays, nothing. The hope that had burned so brightly was beginning to flicker, guttering in a wind of exhaustion and doubt. My eyes were burning, the script on the pages blurring into meaningless squiggles. I was slumped at my work table, surrounded by towering stacks of rejected books, the silent witnesses to my failure. Defeat tasted like stale tea and dust. I thought about my family in the other room, waiting for the final blow. I had failed them. Maybe Edwin was right. Maybe I was just playing with papers. I rested my head in my hands, the rough texture of the old library table cool against my forehead. I was ready to give up. My gaze drifted aimlessly across the last remaining shelf I had yet to fully inspect. It was a small collection of poetry, tucked away in a dusty corner. I had dismissed them earlier, thinking Alistair would have chosen a more serious, imposing volume to hide something so important. But his descendant's diary had said, matched by the vessel that carries it. What if the match wasn't about size, but about sentiment? My eyes landed on one final, unassuming book. It was small, bound in simple, dark green leather, its title barely visible in faded gold leaf. A Garden of Mortal Delights. It wasn't a famous work, just a minor collection of poems about love and loss. I had passed over it a dozen times, but something, some last shred of instinct, made me reach for it. I picked it up. It felt wrong. It was heavier than it should have been for its size. The covers, the bookboards, felt rigid, unnaturally thick. My heart, which had been beating with a slow, tired rhythm, suddenly gave a powerful thud against my ribs. My hands began to tremble. This was it. I could feel it in the very fibers of the paper. I carried the book to my work table as if it were a bomb. I switched on my powerful task lamp, the bright, clean light illuminating the book's surface. Using a spatula, one of my finest conservation tools, I gently probed the inside front cover, where the paste-down end paper met the board. There was a seam, almost invisible to the naked eye, a hairline crack that didn't follow the natural grain of the paper. With the delicate precision of a surgeon, I worked the tip of the spatula into the seam, carefully lifting the end paper. It came away with a soft, dry tearing sound, revealing not the pulpboard I expected, but another layer of thin, dark paper. It was a false compartment, a meticulously crafted secret pocket, hidden within the book's cover for over 300 years. My breath caught in my throat. Inside the shallow recess lay a single piece of folded vellum. It was yellowed with age, but it had been protected from the air and light, and was in a state of near-perfect preservation. My fingers shook so much I could barely grasp it. I lifted it out. It was heavier than paper, with the supple, durable feel of old animal skin. I unfolded it carefully on the clean blotter paper on my desk. The ink was a faded brown, but the Jacobean script was clear and elegant. And there, at the bottom, was a signature that made the air rush from my lungs. Charles R., for Charles Rex, the King. Beneath it, a large, ornate royal seal, pressed into dark red wax, was still intact, the image of the lion and the unicorn clear and sharp. It was the Royal Charter, a direct grant from the King of England, bestowing the lands of Blackwood Manor upon Baron Alistair Blackwood and his heirs, in perpetuity for services rendered unto the Crown during times of great turmoil and peril. It wasn't a deed that could be contested. It was a royal decree. It was absolute. It was unassailable. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it, the silent, powerful piece of history lying under my lamp. The quiet librarian had found the kingdom's deed. I walked out of the library, the vellum charter held carefully in my hands. The house was deathly quiet. I found them in the grand hall, gathered around the cold fireplace like mourners. Uncle Caspian, my aunt, Edwin, and Mr. Gable. They were having one last grim meeting before the next day's hearing. They were discussing which assets would be easiest to liquidate first. They barely looked up as I entered. Their world had shrunk to the size of their own despair. Edwin, seeing me, let out a short, bitter laugh. "Come to say your goodbyes to the old place, Ruby? Not now, we're busy." I didn't say a word. I walked to the massive oak table that dominated the center of the room and gently, deliberately placed the vellum charter on its polished surface. The four of them stared at it, a strange object dropped from another world. "I believe this is what you've been looking for," I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing slightly in the silent hall. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mr. Gable, his face a mask of disbelief, rose slowly from his chair. He put on his spectacles and leaned over the table, his hands trembling as he reached for the document. He held it up to the light, his eyes scanning the lines of faded script. He traced the signature with a reverent finger. He stared at the wax seal. A choked sound escaped his throat. "My God," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "The great seal of the realm, a king's own signature. It's real. This is the Royal Charter." He looked up, first at my uncle, then at me, his eyes wide with awe. This isn't just a defense, Caspian. This is a checkmate. Their entire case is built on the absence of this document. It's over. We've won." The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence filled with the weight of shattered assumptions. My aunt started to cry, silent tears tracking down her pale cheeks. My uncle simply stared at the charter, then at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if seeing me for the very first time. And Edwin. Edwin looked at me, his arrogance and despair stripped away, leaving behind a raw, stunned vulnerability. The hero writer, the family star, had been saved by the quiet girl with the dusty books. The victory wasn't loud. It didn't come with the roar of a crowd or the flash of a camera. It came with the soft, triumphant rustle of ancient vellum. The aftermath was as swift as it was decisive. Mr. Gable made a single phone call to Ms. Jennings at Thorne & Associates. He described the document in his possession with quiet, professional relish. There was, he later told us, a very long pause on the other end of the line. Within the hour, a formal notice was emailed. The Devereux family was withdrawing their lawsuit, effective immediately. Just like that, the storm that had threatened to tear our world apart had vanished, leaving behind a strange, calm, and deeply awkward new reality. The relief that washed over Blackwood Manor was immense, but it wasn't celebratory. There were no champagne corks popped, no triumphant toasts. The family was saved, but their worldview had been fractured. They didn't know how to look at me anymore. I was no longer the quiet footnote. I was the author of their salvation, and the role reversal left them clumsy and uncertain. At dinner that night, the conversation was painfully stilted. My Uncle Caspian, in a gesture he clearly thought was magnanimous, cleared his throat and announced, "Ruby, we owe you a great debt. A handsome reward is of course in order. Name your price." He completely missed the point. I hadn't done it for money. I had saved our home, our legacy, and he was treating it like a transaction. "That won't be necessary, Uncle," I said quietly. My aunt, trying to be helpful, chimed in. "We must have that wonderful book framed to commemorate the moment. It can hang in the hall." She was praising the vessel, the decorative object, still unable to fully grasp that the true value had been in the knowledge required to find and understand its contents. The most profound change, however, was in Edwin. I didn't see him for the rest of that day. The next afternoon I was in the library, carefully placing the royal charter into a climate-controlled archival box when he appeared in the doorway. He looked hesitant, stripped of all his usual swagger. He walked over to my work table and just stood there for a moment, looking at the books, the tools, the world he had never once tried to understand. "I came to say thank you," he said, his voice low, "and to say, I'm sorry." I looked at him, waiting. "Not just for what I said in the archive room," he continued, finally meeting my eyes. "For all of it, for my entire life. I've been so arrogant. I thought being a Blackwood was about winning, about being the best on the field. I measured everyone by that standard, and I was wrong." He gestured around the library. "I always saw this place as your hiding spot, somewhere you went to get away from us. I never realized this was your training ground. I was always on a horse showing off. You were in here, learning how things actually work." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I thought strength was loud. I thought it was about making people look at you." He looked at me then, and his gaze was clear, filled with a respect I had never seen there before. "I was wrong. You're the strongest person in this family, Ruby." It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. I accepted his apology, and I could see that it was genuine. But as he spoke, a quiet, powerful realization bloomed within me. I hadn't done it for him. I hadn't done it for any of them. I hadn't spent those sleepless nights hunting through history to finally win their approval. I did it because the puzzle called to me. I did it because I loved this house, not for its grandeur, but for the stories held in its stones and on its shelves. I did it to protect the history I was a part of. The validation I was receiving now, the apologies and the praise, felt strangely muted. It was like applause after the curtain has already fallen. The true victory, the deep, resonant thrill, had been mine alone, in the silent, lamplit library. In the moment I unfolded that piece of vellum and read the king's words, I had found my own worth, not in their eyes, but in the quiet confidence of my own skills. In the months that followed, a new order settled over Blackwood Manor. I was no longer invisible. My Uncle Caspian, guided by Mr. Gable's firm advice, formally appointed me the official curator of the Blackwood collection. He gave me a generous budget to properly catalog, conserve, and secure the entire library and archives. My sanctuary became a recognized, vital part of the estate's legacy. The family began to consult me on matters of history, on art, on the very documents that governed their lives. They started to listen. They learned to see the value in the quiet, meticulous work I did. My relationship with Edwin found a new, healthier equilibrium. The rivalry, which had always been entirely one-sided, was gone, replaced by a foundation of mutual respect. He started spending time in the library, Not to talk, but just to sit and read, to share the quiet space with me. He would ask me questions about my work, and he would listen, truly listen, to the answers. He was learning a new language, the language of patience and history, and it was changing him. One day, about a year after the charter was found, I was guiding a renowned historian from Cambridge University through the library. She had heard about the discovery and was writing a paper on privately held royal documents. As I was explaining the unique properties of the vellum and the history of the king's seal, Edwin came in. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood by, listening with genuine fascination. When the historian asked to see another set of related manuscripts from a high shelf, Edwin, the former star of the equestrian world, quietly went and got the stepladder and a box, holding it steady for me as I retrieved the necessary volumes. It was a simple, mundane act of service, but it spoke more loudly than any trophy he had ever won. Our family had been saved by a document, not a derby, and we were all the better for it. Looking back, I realized that being underestimated for all those years was a strange kind of gift. It gave me the freedom to cultivate my passions without the pressure of expectation. While all eyes were on Edwin, I was left alone in the quiet, allowed to grow into the person I was meant to be, to hone a skill that no one else valued until it was the only thing that could save them. My life taught me that true strength doesn't always roar. It doesn't need an audience or a podium. Sometimes it's as quiet as the turning of a page. It's found in the patience to search, the knowledge to understand, and the courage to act when your moment finally arrives. Your value isn't determined by the applause you receive, but by the work you do when no one is watching. In the end, the quiet librarian didn't just save her family's home, she found her own. It wasn't made of stone and timber, but of self-worth and purpose, a place where she finally truly belonged. I want to thank you for listening to my story. It's a reminder that everyone has a unique skill, a quiet power that the world might not see at first glance. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had a hidden talent or a quiet skill that turned out to be a secret weapon in a critical moment? Share your story. I think we can all learn from each other. And if my journey resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Share this with anyone you know who has ever felt like the quiet one in the room. Remember to value the libraries in your life, whether they are buildings full of books or the quiet, brilliant people who are so often overlooked. Thank you for joining me.